Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Schatz, and I'm a scientific program manager for the NIHS Office of Data Science. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to the ELK seminar series. By the way of background, ELK stands for Environmental Health Language Collaborative, and our mission is to advance integrative environmental health research by promoting access, use, and harmonization of data through interoperable terminologies and best practices. You can get involved with ELK by visiting ELK website, joining our listserv, or contacting ICF support team, Charles Schmidt, who is the director of the Office of Data Science, or myself, using the emails provided on the slides. Having said that, I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Harry Caulfield is a staff data scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He received his PhD in Integrative Life Sciences from Virginia Commonwealth University, and the integrative part highlights the focus on how to bring different kinds of biomedical data together. Harry's expertise is spanning microbiology, proteomics, network biology, and data science. His research has focused on developing computational tools for biomedical applications, including data integration, knowledge graph constructions, and natural language processing. He has contributed to large-scale projects such as Exomizer, Monarch Initiative, and Bridge to AI, and has recently developed novel algorithms and software for extracting knowledge from unstructured data. So thank you very much, Harry, for agreeing to speak. I will stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria. And thanks to everyone here for allowing me a chance to discuss some of my recent work. I'll be sharing my screen here. And there we go. So the title of this talk is based in the idea of kind of grounding these large language models, or LLMs, in reality. And I'll go into some detail about why I think that's necessary, or really why I think that's the best path forward for working with these types of computational methods. And I'm going to start out from a fairly philosophical standpoint here, and then kind of focus on more of the technical details, because I think we are facing some very high level questions lately in how we apply these computational methods to things that in many cases used to be more human level problems. One of the big questions here is, are knowledge harmonization discoveries still even jobs for humans? Or are we facing a point where this might be a problem that is best solved by these emerging artificial intelligence or AI methods? If it is, in fact, a job that humans still have a lot of value in, and without giving too much away, I think it is, what tools can help us work best with these emerging methods? Because I think they have their own values too. How can we focus on their particular strengths while allowing the value of human knowledge curation to best complement AI-based technologies, rather than fully competing with these methods, or facing the possibility that we may be replaced by them. And I think this is a sentiment that's well shared throughout the media and throughout peer-reviewed literature, irrespective of domain. We regularly see headlines like this one from last fall saying, why AI is a know-it-all, know-nothing. Because there is this public perception that AI methods both have access to massive quantities of information, but are very good at presenting the idea that they're much more capable of doing a lot with this knowledge, or doing more than we may initially expect. And that's not true across the board. This is especially important once we get to this idea of hallucinations, and particularly in biomedical sciences and sciences more broadly. We do know that these large language models in their generative applications are certainly capable of wholesale inventing things, of creating seemingly sensible text out of essentially their existing parameters, but there's no accounting for whether that text has any basis in reality or in existing knowledge. That is at present more of a human job to verify these claims. And of course, there's been extensive work. I'm citing just one paper here. Into looking into the approaches taken to mitigate, or at least be very aware of the hallucinations or the sometimes called confabulations that these models can generate in their everyday use. And much of the findings thus far, yes, come down to yes, being very aware of the sources that these models have, being aware of the data that they're pulling from, and realizing that yes, even if in the aggregated literature or knowledge in any one resource, there will be discrepancies, there will be inconsistencies, and that in itself is not a solved problem. We don't have a single across the board way to resolve the fact that that two ideas may be true under some circumstances, but not others. And that is kind of the beauty of science in itself. But to narrow down a bit more from these very high level questions, I'm going to ask, where does knowledge come from to begin with? Like I keep talking about knowledge in the abstract, but what do we actually mean when we're talking about knowledge to begin with? I think one way we can frame it is the result of repeated observations. In practice, we want to be able to learn from these observations. We want to be able to consistently record them. These are our major tasks in themselves that we usually associate with human activities. But increasingly, we want to be able to do this at very large scale, whether it's even one experiment where the scope of the work is very large. We want to be able to cover numerous sites. We want to include numerous participants. We have thousands, perhaps even millions of samples that we want to be able to track and integrate observations across. And then once we look at the existing literature, we want to be able to say, okay, well, I made these observations. Have they been observed before? Is there something like them that's been observed before? What has been observed previously that we may be able to use to verify our own findings. So just learning from the literature and comparing findings are things that may be ripe for some automation. But the question is, how do we even go about doing that? And then the next question, of course, is, how do we integrate all those observations in a consistent way? When even at the small scale, we may have different studies of replicates. We have existing bodies of structured, curated knowledge that don't always integrate or harmonize very well. Sometimes you can find very similar observations across different fields or disciplines, sometimes even phenomena that have been observed in the context of, say, electrical engineering or computer science turn out to be very relevant to things that we'd observe in biology or the biomedical sciences. So if we have these similar concepts, how do we even recognize that they're similar to begin with when they've been described in these different contexts? And for the purposes of this talk, how do we automate those in a way that we can perhaps benefit from AI in? And for me, at least, this all comes down to needing structured data. We need some kind of underlying structure to harmonize this knowledge. Traditionally, this has been the role of having just consistent data models, of having standards for producing and working with the data to begin with, as well as ontologies and controlled vocabularies to define and ground those specific concepts in some kind of shared truth, as well as defining the hierarchy between them to be able to say, okay, well, this concept is in fact a subclass of this broader concept, and if we have these similar concepts that are both subclasses of the same parent concept, that's important for us to know as well. These tools are absolutely wonderful. I would say they're essential to the past, present, and future of biomedical data science, but they do not do the work of actually structuring the data for us. That is still a job for humans, and traditionally has been. The curation and organization of the data has been a job of human domain experts, often limited supply. It requires access to these multifaceted forms of data, which is not always a given. And we need tools to actually make it possible, whether it's tools to enable the human domain experts access to the data, to work with the standards, to know what's present in a given ontology, or to know, even in the first place, whether an ontology is appropriate for the kinds of concepts, or whether those concepts are perhaps not represented in any known ontology. These require a meeting of the experts with the data and the tools, and perhaps even other resources. So I'm not going to pretend that this has not been an area of intense work in biomedical sciences for decades on end, with many successes. And there's been a kind of a general trend over the years from more rule-based methods for automating these processes, or at least helping out human domain experts, towards more intensive statistical approaches. And in some cases, those rule-based methods are in fact very, very effective. So for these type of methods, I'm talking about things like regular expressions or rule-based parsers that will be able to go through a set of data, especially unstructured data like text, and say, okay, well, here are the things that we're looking for. For example, here's text that includes the phrase interacts with. So we're going to infer that means something is interacting with something else. We can extract that. At a larger scale, once you start combining many of these rules together, you get rule-based extractors like the SemMedDB project, which you can still download the results from off of NLM resources. But as time went on, people also noticed, okay, well, in some cases, it's really the enrichment of terms or given annotations, like the Melody project did much of this. In these cases, it's more along the lines of, okay, well, we see term A and term B tend to co-occur in the same type of text, so we know that there's likely some kind of relationship between them. Or in some cases, we know, okay, well, this term just occurs an awful lot in the literature. If we see something like toxin in the literature a lot, well, maybe that's not quite as informative as knowing the name of a specific toxic chemical. So within the more recent years, we saw the emergence of neural networks in their applications in natural language processing. The LSTMs, or the long short-term memory-based networks, were a great early success story. With the downside that they had to be trained on simply massive quantities of data, and generally data that looked quite a bit like the data that you were trying to extract further knowledge from. That took time, that took computational energy. So researchers realized eventually that, okay, well, what if we did much of that in advance? What if our models didn't have to learn language from scratch every time we wanted to train them in a given tasks? So we began to see the emergence of these foundational language models, like BERT model and other kind of transformer-based approaches, where the idea was then, okay, we already have a model that's been trained to recognize the patterns inherent to language itself. So now we can build on those models to accomplish our more specific tasks, whether it's in a given domain or with a specific subset of the literature, or depending on our purposes, even just use the language models as they are. And again, there's some applications where, yeah, using these models like BERT, yeah, still perform quite well. But in more recent years, we begin to see more focused approaches like these multitask learning approaches, where the model, in fact, has to do kind of multiple things at the same time, and then learn from the results of the individual tasks, especially in cases where there's kind of a dependent relationship. You may realize, okay, well, we're looking for interactions between things in the literature. We know that there's certain types of interactions that may indicate, for example, maybe one of these things is a chemical or the other is a protein, versus other things that are less likely to be described as interacting. So luckily we have approaches that are capable of recognizing these things as well. But yeah, we're now firmly in the realm of statistical knowledge, and as of the past few years, that means large language models. Like those other methods, large language models are building on that rich history of essentially statistical representation of language. In a very simplistic way, this means they're essentially representing likelihood of any one word or a token having a location in a sequence after other words or tokens in that sequence. So for example, here, if we already have a sequence and we know it says, where are we? Then it's very likely that the next word will be something like going, or maybe something similar like staying or living. It will probably not be a word like dog or potato. So in the small scale, this is fairly useful to know, but this really gets useful once we assemble it into a much larger scale. Once we apply this kind of approach with some variations to much larger collections of text. In the case of OpenAI's GPT-3 model, this is a model trained on more than 500 gigabytes. The estimates are usually around 570 gigabytes of text from various internet sources, including Wikipedia, GitHub repositories, inevitably a number of scientific journals, books, just a whole span of human language. Their newer GPT-4 models, while they have a different architecture, are estimated to be trained on orders of magnitude more text to the tune of about 50 terabytes in total. And the resulting models have more parameters. That is, they're literally just considering more possibilities of language, and in theory, that makes them better able to accomplish a wider variety of tasks. Now, in practice, when we're interacting with these models, it's usually not directly. It's usually through some other kind of software framework. If you've ever used ChatGPT, you're not directly using these models. There are some additional tuning and what's usually called guardrails to restrict the degree to which the model is just generating at will. So the interfaces that we access these models through do still have a pretty big role in what we get from them. But what we get from them, as I alluded to earlier, may at times be fabricated knowledge. It may be these hallucinations, or sometimes called confabulations. And here I'm going to term that as any output that looks believable, but really doesn't have a basis in reality, or at best it has maybe a partial basis. That is because these language models are grounded in language. They're not grounded in fact. They're not trained on fact. At best, some of these guardrails or human in the loop editing may push them a bit more towards fact. And newer models do in fact seem to be slightly less prone to these confabulations, but they are still present. So the figure that I'm showing here is from this group called Vectara, where they're attempting to measure the degree of hallucination, specifically on a document summarization task. So they're just giving these models a very small document and saying, okay, can you summarize this further? They're not evaluating whether the summary is any good or not. Really, they're just evaluating, the completely novel or seemingly hallucinated ideas. And yeah, at least throughout the models that they test, about somewhere between 2 to about just under 1% of the summaries that they get back, yes, do include hallucinations, which is not as bad as it could be, but still non-zero, and something that we need to keep in mind, especially when we're working with tasks that may not have any tolerance for inventing things from whole cloth. One of the more recent strategies for addressing this is by providing these models with information from beyond its own parameters. We call this retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And this can be especially useful if we've also focused the task that the model is to perform onto a specific set of knowledge and tools. So that's what we call an agent-based architecture, or just using task-specific agents. So these are methods that I'm going to go into in a bit more detail shortly. But just to underscore the tendency for these models to hallucinate or create these confabulations, for example, if I just directly ask the OpenAI's GPT-4o model to please provide the corresponding identifier from the gene ontology for each of the following terms, and I give it a list of text terms. Just want the identifiers from them. I know it's been trained on the gene ontology. I know it knows what it is. It has likely absorbed all of the gene ontology in its training. However, if I specify a format for its output and I give it these text labels, on any given set, it's likely that 90% of results are going to be incorrect in some way. This is true with other ontologies. It's true, although somewhat to a lesser degree, if you also give the model access to web search, so can essentially do a lookup of these terms and try to find the corresponding ID. But when it comes down to it, it has a lot of difficulty with things that are primarily numbers or primarily dependent on the sequence of those alphanumeric terms. To it, maybe there's not actually a lot of difference between Go 00900729 and Go 00700373, despite the fact that in practice, these are ontology terms that have two different labels and mean two different things. So LLMs certainly haven't solved this problem yet, and at least for now, it kind of seems like it's still space for human beings. But as I alluded to, there are tools that can help. And specifically in the case of getting structured data that is still aware of the value and the existence of ontologies and controlled vocabularies. Or more broadly, if our task is, okay, we want to be able to translate unstructured scientific data directly into structured knowledge. Maybe we even have a schema for a structure or a data model that we want to use, and we do want to be aware of those unique identifiers, like what we get from an ontology, while avoiding the creation of incorrect identifiers or incorrect relationships between concepts and their identifiers. We may also want to go one step further and say, okay, well, what if we want to be able to ask questions about these data sources in natural language? Well, at least the problem of translating that unstructured data directly into the structure is something that we address with this method called SPIRES, or Structured Prompt Interrogation and Recursive Extraction of Semantics. This is kind of the first method for information extraction that's grounded in reality. We have a whole software package called OntoGPT that this is usable through. There's a corresponding paper in bioinformatics. But the basic idea here is that if you have a data schema, this is written in the LinkML data modeling language, OntoGPT, and through this SPIRES method, will use your choice of large language model to use that to follow directions. It essentially translates this data schema or model into the set of prompts that a large language model will use. At the same time, it will also interface directly with the external sources like ontologies and knowledge bases. So the language model doesn't even really have a chance to hallucinate those identifiers. It's at no point is it actually asked to provide the identifiers itself. We realize that's a job better suited by other tools rather than to have just generate them from scratch. So in practice, this works like this. If I just kind of take in this case, the abstract from a paper. In this case, it's one about environmental health and microbial infections of recreational water, like swimming pools. I use OntoGPT in this case with a pre-made template called environmental sample that's designed just to extract details about samples that have been captured in experiments. In this case, I used an open source Llama model. This is the new Llama 4 Scout Instruct model. There's sometimes there's variation among models, but the newer models all seem to do roughly about as well. At least as tasks like this. What I get is here on the right. My template has slots in it to extract things like the location. In this case, it's in Alexandria, Egypt. Uh, things like the environmental material, well, it's liquid water. At least that's what the corresponding envo term is. The environments. In this case, it linked it to a private swimming pool. Later, it'll also identify public swimming pool. So I think in this case, they actually both were the subject of the samples. In this case, we've also attempted to extract some relations here, that is causal relationships. Now, this doesn't go into a lot of detail because it doesn't entirely capture the nuance of what's expressed in the text, but that's always going to be a challenge to some degree when doing information extraction, is to capture, just the right level of detail that you're interested in. But at least in this case, we realize, okay, well, there's some kind of relationship between public swimming pools and parasitic infections, as well as flow rate. So again, we either need a more detailed template to get those more specific details. But if this is the kind of level of detail you're looking for, then I'd call this a success. Especially because, as compared to more traditional named entity recognition or relation extraction methods, this requires no further training. This is just using the model directly. At no point did we have to tune it or train it on our specific domain or for what specific kinds of things we're looking for. Although that certainly can help. This kind of approach is useful for more routine tasks as well, or instances in which we just really want the model to follow directions, but we want it to be able to do it in a reproducible way. For example, here I have a figure that's rather complex, along with its corresponding figure legend. This is about prenatal air pollution. And the label, was written for humans rather than for computers. So it's the descriptions are somewhat complex. It turns out I can use OntoGPT with the Spires method and the figure legend to just break it down into not only the title of that figure, but into its specific subpanels as well, which right away makes it easier for me to understand, but could make it easier for subsequent methods to extract specific portions of the figure as well, if they know already. Again, without doing any kind of visual analysis, this is not using vision models, just the text in the legend. If I want to know right away, okay, well, which part of this text is actually measuring estimates involving PM 2.5 versus other metrics, then yeah, right away this will tell me, okay, well, that's in 1C, and I kind of have to dig into the legend quite a bit to find that out otherwise. This is using a slightly different model than the other one. Let's use kind of more of a code-based model because this is a task that requires a greater adherence to specific rules rather than kind of extrapolating based on the available text. So I mentioned that one of the key details in these kinds of operations is having a consistent data model. For our purposes, this is often the BioLink model, which I believe was actually the subject of another webinar in this series recently, along with LinkML. But the key idea of something like BioLink is that it defines some of the higher level types of things and their corresponding knowledge sources, which makes it much easier to assemble and harmonize those observations, especially if you're building something like a knowledge graph, as shown here. You want to be able to say, okay, well, I have genes from multiple sources, I have diseases from multiple sources, maybe I even have pathways that may involve those the relationships between those genes and those diseases. But despite the fact that I'm getting them from multiple sources, I want them to be all harmonized within a single model, and that's exactly what something like BioLink can do. Now, as for knowledge graph specifically, I'll take a slight sidebar to mention some of the other tooling that we've developed for that, as it's relevant for this overall goal of integrating the knowledge in one place, especially if it is a knowledge graph we've developed this whole framework that we call KG Hub that involves not only a set of tools for working with and transforming these extracted data bits, um, but for establishing practices in how to share the metadata about them, how to what kind of tooling to provide, what kind of or how to share the underlying models and the documentation. Because this is an area where, unfortunately, there's not a lot of standardization. There are many different ways to share a knowledge graph. There's many different ways to document the underlying process that goes into building that knowledge graph. So that was one of our main goals here is, how do we make that more consistent to begin with? And so that's exactly what the KG Hub framework is intended to do. And certainly you can read more about that in our 2023 bioinformatics paper, or just visit kghub.org. So if we're using something like the Spires method or AutoGPT or even other tools that I'll introduce shortly, our main goal here is just to establish this set of triples, integrate them into a single knowledge graph where we don't necessarily have each concept as its own node. We want to be able to merge different observations into the same concepts and then have a nice harmonized graph where we can reliably say things like, okay, well, this, we observe the same triple or the same relationship across numerous sources. Here are the sources. We can still identify those as properties of the association. That's all compatible with the model. But we also want to be able to identify where something has been observed multiple times. As alluding to my earlier philosophical questions, that's much of the whole point of deriving knowledge from things to begin with. So AutoGPT has been out for actually, close to a couple of years now. So that's given us enough time to apply it to a number of different areas. One of which is in improving annotation in the medical action ontology. We've had a whole there's preprint out about that I think should be a real lab publication soon, as well as working with the Micronutrient Information Center. This is a group at the Linus Pauling Institute at Oregon State, where they have a lot of human curated information about relationship between micronutrients in people's diets and the corresponding phenotypes, diseases, and beyond. This is all kind of human readable data, which is great. But if our goal is to integrate that with something like our Monarch knowledge graph, then we need tools like AutoGPT and others to extract that information and get into that consistent data structure. We've also applied the Spires method and AutoGPT to pathology report summarization and categorization. For example, these reports may only have a few sentences describing a particular sample, and we want to know right away, okay, well, is this a carcinoma? Is this something that needs some kind of clinical follow-up? Or at least does it need more investigation, or is it just benign? That's something that's very useful to categorize just on the fly. We've worked with the phenopacket standard for representing the phenotypes that a particular patient has, especially in context of rare disease or genetic disease. We're working on applying this towards malnutrition prediction, specifically in pediatric oncology patients. It's an area where you want to be able to predict likelihood of malnutrition before it starts, as these are very sensitive patient presentations. So sometimes this comes down to extracting data from health records. And then finally, we have this resource called ESS Dive, based at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And that's the sort of a deep insight for earth science data, because this is a resource of earth and environmental science data sets, where the goal here is to be able to harmonize the types of variables and metrics that are used across different studies, so we can better integrate them and see how many observations are consistent across studies. So that's another area of application. I'll do a slight dive into that Maxo work a bit, because I think that's especially interesting. This is so the medical action ontology, if you're not familiar with it, essentially is an a collection of medical actions where those actions are things like diagnostic procedures, therapeutic procedures. In this example, something like copper chelator agent therapy is something that's in the maximum ontology, but we also want to be able to use that to link these medical actions to specific phenotypes and diseases. Like in this case, we want to be able to say, okay, well, that therapy is used to prevent cirrhosis, and that has a corresponding term in the human phenotype ontology, as well as a disease, in this case, Wilson disease anemia, which has its own term in the Mondo disease ontology. This is something that, yes, certainly can be done through human curation, and traditionally it has been a job of human curators just to go into literature and evaluate it and say, okay, well, there's some evidence from this paper that this particular therapy does, or at least is in active use for preventing this this phenotype, or in the treatment of this disease or diagnosis of this condition. But this, as you can imagine, is a very complicated field with a lot of knowledge that isn't always expressed in perfect detail. So we've developed a process to extract these types of annotations directly from the literature, and then have some subsequent grounding and domain expert review. So the domain expert is still involved in the process, but they don't have to start from scratch. They receive a lot of assistance from the large language models in determining which of these annotations should actually make it into the curated ontology. So similarly, for this Micronutrient Information Center project, we're attempting to extract a number of different types of relationships, such as relationships of nutrient to disease phenotype, as well as things like nutrient to health status of a body part or system. These may be really high-level claims like, okay, well, calcium is important to bone and teeth health, but there may be some things. And in fact, there are a number of relationships that may not be quite as obvious as well. Here, I've provided one of the Micronutrient Information Center's nutrient-based kind of essentially cards, providing a brief summary. And this is somewhat structured, but they have much more data in the resource that we'd love to be able to structure. So much of this is wrapped up into an ingest as part of the Monarch initiative, and this involves OntoGPT and the COSA data processing tool, which is also an invaluable resource for assembling structured data, including knowledge graphs. So as for our more recent tools, I mentioned that Spire's tool has been out a little while. One thing that does not do is this retrieval augmented generation, which can be limiting sometimes because it means that it's limited in the amount of data that it can access. It's primarily accessing data from the corresponding ontologies and knowledge resources that it's pointed at, and from the model itself. However, in many cases, we want to work directly with one or more data resources, particularly if we're trying to curate them further, or if we're planning on integrating them with our own work in some way. Sometimes we just want to be able to search them more easily and ask basic questions like, okay, well, is there actually a term that's describing the thing that I'm thinking of in this ontology? And traditionally, that's a very difficult question to ask. It involves a lot of just raw text searching. So that's one of the reasons why we created this tool called Curate GPT. You can actually try this out in a somewhat limited capacity online in curategpt.io. The basic idea here is that this interfaces with large language models, whether it's through a separate server or even a local language model, and it creates a vectorized version of a given resource, such as an ontology, that it uses to help with searches, but then also to use those entries from that resource as examples to pass to a large language model. So then you can also say things like, okay, well, I have a claim that was made in a paper here. It seems relevant to a particular ontology that I'm trying to curate further. How can I structure this claim in a way that's compatible with that ontology? And then, yeah, so the examples are taken directly from the source ontology and can even be contextualized further from other knowledge sources like PubMed or beyond. So it has an interface as well, and if you load up curategpt.io, you should see something like this. I've already loaded this with the Cobb ontology, which is very very small, high level ontology that's just designed to define concepts that are likely to be present in a number of other structured resources. So it includes terms like cell, things that are likely to be present in a variety of different places. So we can certainly search this, but we can also say something like, okay, I'm gonna chat with it instead. So in fact, if you select on the left the chat option and ensure the collection is set to Aunt Cobb, then you can ask a natural language question like, okay, what is a good term to describe a cell? And what you'll get is a description on the bottom. In this case, it says a good term to describe a cell would be a cellular anatomical entity. This is not the LLM pulling from its own knowledge. It is in fact pulling from the Cobb ontology, not just because it's been told to, but because it's been provided with examples specifically from that ontology that match this search. In fact, it can prove that if you look at the reference, which in the interface is provided after that summary as the structured entry directly from Cobb. You can also see other details like, okay, well, this is actually using a term that's pulled from the gene ontology that's listed at the bottom. But even within this Cobb ontology, it has relationships to other terms. For example, it is a subclass of cellular component, which has subclass cellular component, and also subclass of material anatomical entity, and those are structures in itself. There's other features in CureGPT as well, including the site seek, which is specifically designed to find the corresponding reference that would support a given claim. I've cheated a little bit here because I know that this is not only a very simple claim to have to back up, but it does have evidence in Cobb. So if I say something like a nucleic acid chain is a molecule, again, probably not going to see a lot of pushback on that. But I also get a reference directly from the Cobb ontology that, okay, well, there is in fact a reference one that says a nucleic acid chain is a molecule. And if I look at the reference, it says explicitly, well, it's a subclass of molecule. But the inference that is getting from a nucleic acid chain is a molecule had to be done by the LLM itself based on the examples that it was provided. And then finally, we don't have to explicitly use an ontology for this. We can also use that as a means for exploring other data sources. So if I take that same claim and I point it at PubMed through the PubMed API instead, then I get different results. In this case, I get matching papers from PubMed. And it selected things like this paper titled 1953, When Genes Became Information. In this case, the LLM will take those references and their abstracts and use that to generate its summary. And it'll cite them in the text as well. It will also, given a set of matching references, it'll also select which ones seem to be more informative for providing the summary. And it'll still provide references to the other papers. They just won't include them in its summary itself. And then finally, I want to discuss this, the newest of our set of tools for working with LLMs, and it's this agent-based tool called Aurelian. So I mentioned agents earlier and how they're good for applying LLMs to specific tasks. In this case, that could be on command line or in a graphical interface. But one task doesn't necessarily mean doing one computational exercise or running one tool. This is more like a task in terms of how we'd have a human do it, which means any one task could involve some degree of domain knowledge, like knowing the LD50 of arsenic. It could involve some kind of technical knowledge, like, okay, well, if I want to do X, I may be able to use tool Y, as well as knowledge about a specific resource or given study. Like even if I know that ENVO exists and it's an ontology that can be used for describing environmental variables, I don't know off the top of my head whether there's a term in it for industrial wastewater. So in this case, I use the Aurelian tool to do that. This is specifically an agent called Mapper that more broadly is just used for finding mappings between either given ontology or even just kind of a more abstract concept in an ontology. So if I just ask it, okay, what's a term that I can use to describe water contaminated with industrial waste? Well, it searches the available ontologies. Notably, at no point did I say you have to use Envo. That's built into the agent that it's aware of the existence of a number of ontologies and their kinds of content. So one of the things it accomplished in the course of this task is to note that, okay, Envo would probably be an appropriate source for this. And then it finds 4 terms and identifies what would probably be the closest match for this. So this is already kind of bridging the gap between a more traditional computational approach where I may have to design a method from scratch to have an LLM go in and say, there's a variety of different things that industrial waste could mean. There's a variety of things that water could mean, while also having to be aware of the tooling that an LLM would have to use to work with ontologies. In this case, I don't have to know about any of that. I can use this agent-based model, or rather this agent-based approach, and it'll do much of the hard work for me, even though I'm still the one asking the question. So we've already built a number of agents of different types into the Aurelian platform, but it's designed really to be more of a general and fairly straightforward agent-based platform. In this case, we have one called the chemistry agent, and that's designed to do things like interpreting chemical formulae and representations. In this case, I have a Smiles representation that just by looking at it, because I'm not a chemist, I did not know was aspirin. But I can plug it into this agent. I can say, okay, well, interpret this Smiles. It'll realize, oh, well, okay, that's 2-acetoxybenzoic acid. It has these functional groups. It doesn't tell me right away what it actually is. So I follow up and I say, okay, can you tell me about the therapeutic applications? And then it says, oh, well, that's acetylsalicylic acid. And then it tells me what it's good for. So in some cases, this is mixing in its own parameterized knowledge. It doesn't necessarily have to look too far to realize what the benefits of aspirin are, but it does have to access some additional tooling to be able to accurately interpret a Smiles string here and realize that corresponds to a specific compound. So again, this is a kind of task that involves multiple types of operations. And then as well, we have the entire Monarch knowledge graph or knowledge base. And there's an agent specifically for interfacing with that. And that means I can ask questions about the types of things that are in this knowledge base. In this case, I asked, what are the symptoms associated with disease? And I provide a Mondo disease ontology identifier. And it comes back to me after searching the database and says, oh, well, that's blepharonasophageal malformation syndrome. And is associated with these following symptoms. Here are their corresponding identifiers. Because this is coming, in those cases, directly from the resource, there's a much lower chance of these being fully confabulated or invented. Rather than if I just asked a language model directly, there's a fairly high chance that it would have just invented the IDs, or maybe not even provided them unless I had kind of pushed it further. And then finally, out of these examples, this is certainly not comprehensive of the agents that can or will be available through this Aurelian platform, is this method that we call talisman, and that's for determining functional enrichment of genes. So if I provided a list of genes, in this case, I just provide 4, and I tell it, are there any functional similarities between these? Then the talisman agent returns a full and a detailed report about the many ways in which they may or may not be functionally similar. And that's because it has access to the sources where it would look up that information. Again, it's not just working directly from its own parameters. And as part of the agent, it's even been provided a specific format for the types of things and the structure of the data that we'd like to see. So the agent not only has access to the right kind of data, it has access to the right kind of instructions for what it should output. So in summary, I'll just say four main things as as a way of addressing those very high level questions that unfortunately at this point remain unsolved, despite the existence of what I think are some great tools for working with LLMs. These large language models are in fact improving, but they do still struggle with grounding in reality. It is not their core competency. They're based in language by design. They're not based in fact by design. I'm not sure there is a computational way to verify facts, but maybe it's worth working towards. At this point, that means human in the loop based curation and knowledge harmonization is still an essential part of the process. Humans are not obsolete in this, and especially not domain experts. I'd like to think that tools like AutoGPT, CurateGPT, and Aurelian are great ways to be able to leverage LLMs to extract structured data and have LLMs perform specific tasks for us, especially in the case of these Aurelian agents. They really can get quite complex and mimic many of the activities that you as a domain expert may need to perform in a variety of contexts, whether you are curating an existing resource, or just performing your own work, or just trying to find out more about a given resource or a field. These are all things that don't have to be difficult. The LLMs really can help with this without rendering any of us obsolete. So with that, I will thank everyone who's contributed to this work, including my colleagues in the Berkeley Bioinformatics Open Source program at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. It's a group that's headed by Chris Mungle. And we work on a variety of different tasks in kind of the intersection of data science and biology and biomedicine. Certainly, if you're interested in a demo of any of the resources mentioned in this presentation or their applications, I'd be happy to provide that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other folks, both in the Monarch Initiative and beyond, including Melissa Handel's group, currently based at UNC, Peter Robinson, who I have listed here at JAX, but he has a couple different appointments, as well as the various sources of funding listed here that have been essential in keeping this work moving. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat or unmute yourself and start and ask the question. And I can probably start with one. So if I understand correctly, AutoGPT needs a predefined template in order to extract information. So how many templates do you have? Or can everyone develop a template to use it for a more specific purpose? Can you explore on that?
Yes, there's a wide variety of predetermined or pre-designed templates that are available for it already, and they will accomplish in some cases, yeah, very, very domain specific tasks. In other cases, they've been defined fairly broadly and wouldn't require much adaptation to a specific task. I'll admit that is one of kind of the immediate limitations of an approach like that, is it does require some definition of a data model, and that's not always a given. But that being said, it's leveraging the benefits of a modeling language like LinkML, in this case, literally LinkML, which has the benefit of being able to work with fairly domain agnostic data schemas. So if somebody already has like a database schema that they've defined in JSON or JSON schema more specifically, or in some other format, then there's a decent chance that it can get translated to something that LinkML can understand, and then AutoGPT can use it. Its basic kind of YAML templating language is also easy to understand as far as I am concerned. I am very likely biased in this regard. And yeah, so if someone isn't really familiar with even the kind of the YAML format, then yeah, that can certainly be limiting. But the way I see it is that it's still much less an obstacle than the traditional need of like training a model from scratch, or assembling an entire training corpus. It's like that part is no longer necessary. Whereas before you need to do that and have some kind of underlying data structure. Now we just need the data schema, and we're pretty much ready to go.
Thank you so much, Harry. And we will give 2 minutes back to our participants and to you. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to everyone that attended. And be on the lookout for our next ELK seminar, I guess at the end of May. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you very much.